Thanks, Rand. So we're so happy to welcome Patricia Falvey here today from Texas. So she's here to talk about her new book, The Titanic Sisters, but I'll give a little bit of introduction first. So Patricia Falvey, the critically acclaimed author of The Yellow House, The Linen Queen, and The Girls of Ennismore, was born in Northern Ireland and immigrated alone to the United States at age 20. A resident of Dallas, she is a frequent speaker at Irish cultural events all around the country, as well as book clubs, libraries, women's groups, and educational institutions. She's a member of the Writers' Garret, the Dallas Institute for Humanities and Culture, and the Irish American Society Book Club of Dallas. Patricia joins us today to chat about her new novel, The Titanic Sisters. Spanning the distance from rural Ireland to New York and Texas in the early 1900s, this book explores the relationship between two sisters whose lives take very different directions after they survive the perilous voyage from Ireland to America aboard the Titanic. This touching saga of sisterhood follows two young Irish women yearning for independence and adventure, only to be faced with the tragedy of that fabled maiden voyage. So I'm going to pass it off to Patricia now, and she'll chat a bit about her experience as a writer and the book, and do a couple of readings, and then we'll have a question-answer discussion time too.
Bryn, Mike, would you turn the microphone on
Sure.
for her? Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Hi everyone.
Hello.
Actually, I was much more comfortable sitting in the audience. But this is nice. Thank you all for coming. I love bookstores. I love readers. I'm at home in these places. So, and among fellow writers, would-be writers. Are you all interested in writing, or pretty much? Yeah,
Maybe.
At least half of you, I would think.
Yeah.
And hopefully you continue to get inspired. I'm not going to talk too much about my journey as a writer, but my first book actually came out in 2010, so I'm still a relative newbie. And that was after about 30 years, let's see, do I date myself? At least 30 years in the financial industry. My background is CPA and a master's in taxation, which was always great fun at parties. The minute you said that's what you did, people moved away. But I always wanted to be a writer. I was born in Ireland, as Bryn told you, and grew up there with my grandmother. And my first book, The Yellow House, was based on a lot of stories that my grandmother told me. And she had been alive during the time of the partition of Ireland, when ultimately the northern part of Ireland, the 6 counties, were cut off from the rest of Ireland. And she was alive during that time. My grandfather, he was a fighter with the Irish Revolution. And my grandmother used to tell me some wonderful stories about how he would come to the back door in the middle of the night, and he would say things like, she would say things like, and he was barefoot, and I had to pull the thorns out of his feet because he was running across the fields, and excuse the French, and the bastards after him. And she was a very colorful woman, and she was part of the Women's Auxiliary. But at that time, the women were not necessarily allowed to get into battle or fire guns, but she went around and passed on messages, in this clandestine sort of thing. I guess the original meetup, we're going to be blowing up a bridge tomorrow night at this time or whatever. And I didn't realize how much her stories had stuck with me. They always say, I was just speaking with a lady now, about people often say to me, well, I have nothing to write about. And I always say, yes, you do. Just go back over your life and you'll start to see all of the great experiences, unique experiences for all of us, that can easily spark a story. And once you start on the story will grow, and that's what happens. And I didn't realize, again, I was having a very nice career. I was ultimately a managing director at PricewaterhouseCoopers. and helping insurance companies save money on taxes, which I think was probably earning me very, very bad karma points for most of that time. But I was, by all accounts, I was having a very good career and had been successful, but the urge to write had never left me. I had tried, when I first came to America, I had tried to sign up as I did sign up as an English major at Suffolk University in Boston, who gave me a foreign scholarship, bless their hearts. And it became pretty evident that a degree from there, which at the time was basically a law school and a business school, that, the chances of getting a well-paying job after leaving, with a degree in English from Suffolk are probably not going to be that great. So I had a little bit of about a year of college in England before I left, and that was business and accounting. And Suffolk again came to the rescue and gave me 1 year's worth of credits if I would move over to be a business major, which I did. And I generally say that was where I postponed my dream until 30 years later. I did try at some point around mid-1990s, I left. I'd been working for Travelers Insurance in Hartford, Connecticut, and I'd gotten divorced and was kind of looking around and saying, okay, maybe I need to move on to something else. And my initial thought had always been to cross the country and experience America. And I'd never gotten to the West Coast, so I ended up moving to Los Angeles with KPMG as one of the other big accounting firms. And the deal was I would work part-time, and in my head, I was going to spend the other half of the time taking classes on writing or screenwriting, going to UCLA, all of this. This was sort of starting to put a dream together. And I found out, of course, very quickly that I was working full-time for part-time money, and that was not working out so well. If you've ever been around the consulting business, you know that you have to be available when the clients are available, and there's no such thing as saying I'm not available on Tuesday. I mean, you can't do that. So anyway, that was the end of that. Then I signed on with Pricewaterhouse, and I was with them like another 9-10 years. But during that time, I was lucky enough to run into a lady from New York. I was in New York for a business meeting, and I was lucky enough to run into a lady who just prevailed on me to join her. She ran an exercise studio in New York, and she kept saying it was too bad I didn't live there because I would love all these ladies who were her clients. And they were all going for a spa week in Jamaica the following month, and I would come. And I'm like, okay, why would I come? I don't know you, I don't know these ladies, whatever. But it was something about the little golden thread that kept whispering to me, saying, you really should go, you never know what can happen, and this lady is so insistent, and I wonder if there's a reason she's asking you to do this. And so after some thought, and she had coaxed my email out of me, and I got an email from her when I returned to Dallas, and sure enough, next thing I knew, I was in Montego Bay, Jamaica. And she took me down to meet the ladies, and as it turned out, there were 12 of them, and 2 of them were literary agents. Now, as an aspiring writer, that is like the golden egg. And I'm like, I was right. The golden thread was there. I mean, there was something whispering me to do this. And I was very, very lucky that one of those 2 literary agents she's semi-retired now, but she's still my agent. And she and her partner, another young woman, she's running the business now, but Denise, in fact, was just here in Sarasota. She comes here every year. She's a good friend of Lucy's. And so, it was a match made in heaven. So the next thing I knew, I was there as a CPA. I wasn't talking about being a writer or anything until about Thursday of that week, when I just happened to mention that I had gone to some writing seminars up at Skidmore College in upstate New York. And it turned out that Denise had a connection with Skidmore, and she said, "Oh, are you interested in writing?" I go, "Well, yes, sort of, but we don't want to like put too much on that, I can't tell you what I've written." And she said, "Well, next time you come, why don't you meet for dinner? And in the meantime, I'll send you," she said, "What do you think you want to write?" And I said, "Well, definitely women's fiction." That's about as far as I've gotten. And she said, "I'll send you some titles and then we can discuss it when you come for dinner," and da-da-da. And so she sent me, mostly it was the Jennifer Weiner kind of what I call the chick lit kind of books that she was recommending. And I knew those were not for me because I had tried writing for Harlequin and a couple of the other, those formulaic stories. And by the time I'd finished a couple of those manuscripts, I wanted to slap the heroine into oblivion. I mean, I just did not like them. And I thought, this is not going to work. But even though I sent them in, and they sent back very nice letters saying, "We like the way you write, but you didn't follow the formula, and you have a subplot, you're not allowed to have subplots," all of this sort of thing. So, I put that away, and that was the end of that. So when I get to New York and have dinner with Denise, I said, "No, I don't want to do that." And she said, "Well, what do you want to do? What do you want to write about?" And out of nowhere, I hadn't even formed these as thoughts in my brain yet. I said, "I want to write a story about based on my grandmother's life, and I want to call it the Yellow House," because she had lived in a house called the Yellow House in the neighborhood. And she said, "Oh, well, how far have you gotten with it?" I said, "Oh, I haven't started it. I just thought of it now." And she gave me, being a real businesswoman, she took out her calendar and said, "Well, 3 months from now, I want the first 50 pages. Now, that's, again, for all of you, any of you who've tried writing or are aspiring writers, that's the sort of moment that you yearn for. You're like, "Oh my God, an agent really wants to see what I'm doing." But it's also like one of the scariest moments because you go, "Oh God, what have I done? How am I going to do this?" And so anyway, way led on to way, and I did the 50 pages and immediately got a response saying, "Where's the rest of it?" And I said, "It's in my head." So I was still, at that point, still working for Pricewaterhouse. I was on an airplane every other week because I ran a national practice. And so when the next few months were difficult because I was writing and then I would have to set it aside and then get on an airplane and fly off to Iowa or wherever I was going. And then I'd come back and it was very hard to pick the threads back up again. And it really wasn't working too awfully well. And I really knew I had a problem when I started having dreams in which my characters were berating me and yelling at me and saying, "Come on already, where's the rest of the story? We're waiting." And honest to God, I mean, that was happening. I was having dreams about it. So finally I said, "Well, that's it. I either make the break now, I will never get this chance again, I'm gonna have to do it." And I knew, as an accountant and somebody who was fairly practical in dealing with numbers and possibilities, I knew the chances of getting published were not high. And that's an understatement. And back then, and this was, like I said, the first book came out in 2010, but even just prior to that, the idea of self-publishing, it was there, but it was not, accepted in the way it is now. And so you still had to go through the gatekeepers of the publishing houses. And so, but Denise was sure she could sell it. And because I kept sending her bits and pieces of it. And so a few months after that, I finally went to where I found all of the senior partners and all the people at Pricewaterhouse. And we were all in Florida, actually. I was down in Fort Lauderdale. And I announced that I was leaving and I was going, and I was, "Well, what firm are you going to?" "Well, I'm not going to another firm. I'm going to, I'm writing a book and I'm going to pursue a career in publishing, I hope. And they, so the eyes started rolling, and, oh, there she goes. The great American novel, she'll be back, We always knew she was a little eccentric, et cetera, et cetera. And and they said, you will stay on and consult. And I said, no. And the reason I was very firm about saying no is because I'd had that experience in California where you cannot just, if once you sign on, your time is their time, and you cannot, do both. You really can't. And I just felt at this point in my life, I owed it to myself. If I was ever going to do it, now is the time to do it. And I was very, very fortunate that 3 months later, I got a 2-book contract from Hachette. And Hachette, you may know, is one of the largest publishers in the world, actually. And I'd never heard of them, but it was like, I said, who? And Denise called me and she said, I still remember, she said, this is going to be the happiest day of your life, that you now have a contract to sign. And she said, but it also will be the beginning of some of the worst days of your life. And I thought, ooh, that's kind of, but she was right. I mean, because the publishing industry is very, very, it's bizarre, to say the least. It doesn't operate on business principles in the way that you think of corporations. They're very slow. The timeline for publishing is a lot of times it's up to 2 years. What you go through in terms of the editing process and all of this. You kind of think that a large publishing house like Hachette would really have a lot of staff that would do all the marketing for you and all of this and that. Doesn't work that way. Fortunately, I think it's James Patterson who is a client of Hachette, and he probably is responsible for half of their profits, I don't know. But if you're a really well-known author, you'll get a lot of that support. If you're a mid-list author, maybe you'll get some. If you're a new author, you'll get maybe one blast at the beginning, and particularly for a debut novel, which usually will get more attention than others. But beyond that, you have to walk a fine line between what the publishers expect from you and what you're really on your own for doing. Although it was very interesting because I was not allowed to contact Barnes & Noble, who at the time were, before the rise again of lovely independent bookstores like this, Barnes & Noble obviously buy a lot of books, and I was told, oh, no, you can't call them. And I said, well, can't I go into the local Barnes & Noble in Dallas? And, well, we can set up a launch for you there if you want, but, you can't go in without our saying so. So it got a little bit squirrely on that. And, of course, I was very obedient because I didn't know what the answers were. How far should I go? How far should I not? And I still remember more wise words from Denise. She said, nobody will ever care about your book as much as you did. And so now I'm with a smaller publisher now, Kensington Publishers in New York, and they have way fewer books but much better support. But I've also learned along the way that you have to take the initiative. The old thing of ask forgiveness, not permission, and so. But the Yellow House did do very well. And because it got some very good exposure, again, as a debut novel. And the second book, The Linen Queen, which is about the industry, the linen industry in Northern Ireland, where all of my female relatives had worked one way or another, including my aunt, my mother, and my grandmother, and my great-grandmother. I called them all yarn spinners, because they're all great storytellers too. But that book, the reviews were equally as good as the Yellow House reviews, but it didn't sell anywhere near as well. And the reason being that that was still with Hachette, that Hachette, the woman who was going to be the publicity director for it, quit the month it was about to be published. And so it became what they call an orphaned book. And that's something that, I'm kind of sad about. And I've tried to get the rights back from them so that I can change the cover. I think a different cover would be probably more appealing. and reissue it, and they keep saying no. So, yeah. But the Yellow House is still selling. It's interesting, a little aside, I was, about 2 years ago, another book came out, lo and behold, called The Yellow House. And it's by this woman, Sarah Broom, who is, she's a writer with the New York Times. And it's about her family home in New Orleans that was destroyed during Katrina. And it went on to win all kinds of prizes and so on and so forth. But all of a sudden, the sales of my Yellow House started going. So that was like, oh, okay. I see how that works. And in fact, you know, on Amazon, every now and then I look at the reviews, and I was finding that people were saying, well, I bought this for my book club, but it turned out to be the wrong book, but I love it anyway. So, you know, these things happen, it's very hard. But to talk about one of the things besides Irish history that I think my grandmother instilled in me was just a love for Ireland itself. And it's a long story, which I won't get into now, about how I ended up having to move to England and never went back to live in Ireland, and always felt a bit cheated by that. And so Ireland's always been kind of very close to my heart. And one of the things, I mean, if you're going to write a book, writing a book is tough. It's a long process, it's a long, lonely process. You question yourself all the time. And unless you have a real passion for the subject matter, you know, it's just not going to be a good thing to do to yourself, actually. I mean, to write for the market, well, you know, this kind of genre is selling right now, I think I'll do that. Yeah, you can do it, and, you know, you may get away with it, you may get it published, it may work out. A lot of times it won't, because a reader can pick up, and I've always been very awed by my readers. They are very smart, and I'm not saying that in a condescending way. I mean, they know, they can tell whether your heart's in that book or not. They can feel that. And you know, somebody said they just, although I did come across a very odd line not too long ago. Somebody posted on Facebook that they had seen a review of a book. In fact, it had been on the bestseller list. I think it was In the Window, maybe it was the book. And this person said, well, I was reading along in this book, and I got the impression the woman was just making it up as she went along. And I'm thinking, okay, you know, isn't that what we all do? But so anyway, but back to passion, and my passion is Ireland. My passion is also history. And the theme in all of 4 of my books so far has been that it's historical fiction, but usually what I try to do is connect the characters to some event that happened in real life, like in this case, the Titanic Sisters. I mean, I connected the story of these 2 girls to the Titanic, and everybody knows the Titanic. The Girls of Ennismore, I connected to 2 things. One, it's kind of like an Irish Downton Abbey. There's the girl from the very rich family, and then the girl who's the tenant farmer's daughter, and they meet, they grow up together, and then the paths separate, and why that is, and the politics that gets involved. So, and it's also the story of, you know, what they used to call the Protestant Ascendancy in Ireland, which is, you know, the people who had the big houses that had been gifted them by the King of England or whatever during, you know, all of Ireland's history, but where they started, and we also had World War I in there, 1914 to 1918, and a lot of the servants from the big houses, as they called them, all went to fight. And when they went in the army, it was like, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after that? And then there was a new tax policy that came in. So it was the beginning of the descendancy, I call it, of the ascendancy. And, but also was the 1916 Irish Easter Rising, which is very, very well known, and certainly well known in Ireland, and I think well known by many of the 35 or so million people in America who can claim Irish heritage. So, and the first, like I said, the Yellow House was about the partition of Ireland ultimately. Second one, the Linen Queen, was actually about World War II. It was set in 1942 in the north of Ireland, and it was about the story of how a small village changed a lot and was affected by young American soldiers being billeted there before D-Day. And a lot of people don't know that there were American soldiers there. And of course, you know, when the day of the Yanks came and all the girls who were working at the mill, you know, go running down to the street to see them, and they look up and they see all these fellows, these very good-looking young men with brilliantly white teeth. That was something that they all remembered. And, you know, yelling at them and so forth, and they're waving their turbans, and it was like, this was wonderful. But again, Belfast was bombed during that time. There was a Belfast Blitz. And again, that was trying to put my characters on the ground against the backdrop of what was going on, and to kind of connect the two so that you're living through that historical experience through these characters. And that's kind of what I like to do. And that is sort of a major theme in all of my books. The Titanic Sisters was the first time I let the girls, my characters, off of the island of Ireland. You know? And I had a hard time. This book was actually first published in London by a UK publisher. And I told them that I wanted to bring the characters to Texas ultimately, and I got a lot of pushback saying, oh, no, all Irish immigrants, quote, all Irish immigrants either go to New York or Boston. I'm like, well, okay, many of them did, and but isn't that what everybody expects? You know, like Texas is different. And when anytime I've been in Ireland, I know from experience, because I've lived on the East Coast, I've lived in California, and I've lived in Texas. And anytime I would say anything about the East Coast, yeah, it's interesting. The West Coast, yeah, maybe a little bit. But Texas, you live in Texas, oh my God. You know, well, of course, Dallas was the big movie thing. And I've had relatives that have come to visit me, and we go up to South Fork, and they know all about who lived in this cottage and whatever, and I'm like, you know, more than I do about this stuff. So, and there was a few years ago when I was home, my sister said, oh, we have to go to this restaurant in Limerick, and it's getting rave reviews, and it's very hard to get into, and we have to make reservations. I go, well, what's it called? It's called the Texas Stakeout. And so I go in, and it was everything that anybody who's not been to Texas but has watched movies about Texas or watched old cowboy movies. I mean, there were the red and white checkered tablecloths, the cigar store Indian, the bows and arrows, the this, the that, and it was like, oh my God, you know? And so my sister, of course, had to tell the waiter that I lived in Texas. The next thing, the owner comes over. You're from Texas, and what do you think? What do you think? And I said, you know, I was trying to be nice. I said, you know, if I didn't know better, I'd think I was back home. That's lovely, you know. So people were excited about it. I tried to tell that. So for the Titanic Sisters, we made a deal that I would bring them initially to New York, and then I would move the action to Texas, because I really wanted, I mean, I'd lived there long enough, and I really wanted to do something. And it set during, besides the Titanic, it also conveniently tied in with the beginning of the oil rush, because the first oil was, it was 1901 at Spindletop, where the first oil gusher was found. And during those years, it was sort of like the old gold rush, and I have a wonderful, I like it, a little town that I call Shotgun City, where it became a camp town because everybody comes to Texas looking for, you know, just as they did go to California for the gold rush, and they were coming for the oil rush. And so a lot of very interesting history there too. And the only thing about historical fiction, and again, I quote our dear friend Denise, who used to say to me, Patricia, you're one of the slowest writers I know. And I said, well, you know, it is historical fiction. I mean, if you want me to do, you know, a story about a girl in Dallas who, you know, is stumbling out of the bar on her Prada heels, you know, I can do that. But I don't want to do that. And so, and the other thing is I feel a real serious obligation to have the history correct. Because a lot of people, readers, they want to enjoy a good story, but they like to learn, you know, something about a background or something they didn't know. And they rely on that to be correct. And I feel it's my obligation to make sure that it is. And a lot of times I will ask a historian to do a review of the book before I release the manuscript or whatever, because I want to try to be sure. And even then, sometimes I'll get one or two small things wrong. And even then, a reader will point it out, you know. I mean, you can always rely on them to pick it up, you know, like, oh, yeah, okay, I'll change that when they reprint it, you know. So anyway, what I'd like to do, I guess, how many of you have read the book? Anybody? No, oh, you see. If I can find my glasses.
Behind you.
There you go.
I thought I might read just a couple of passages and then I'll open it up because I would rather talk to what you want to hear about than what I want to tell you about. So I was just going to read a few short passages. The first, as Bryn mentioned in her opening, this is about two sisters, Delia and Nora. And one of the things too, in terms of writing process, the two girls are very different. One is more introspective. She's better educated than her sister because she loves to read. And there's a teacher that takes her under her wing and gives her a lot of books and so on and so forth. So she's very quiet. Whereas the other girl, Nora, is very rough and ready, and you know, she hates school and loves the boys and all of this, and she doesn't have time for any of this nonsense. And so they're both very different, but they both have the opportunity to go together. Not that Nora is very happy about it. She was not happy that her sister was coming along, but that's the whole thing. And there's a basic conflict between these two pretty much all the way to the end. And that's what you need in a decent book, I guess. A decent read is conflict. So anyway, this is just the opening part of it. It opens up in Donegal, which is the northwest tip of Ireland, and very rural, very, very beautiful, one of the most beautiful counties, I think, in Ireland. And this, I think, is 1911. The letter from America changed all our lives. The postman presented it to me with great ritual, as if it were a fine jewel. In his memory, he said, no one in my small village of Kilcross in County Donegal, at the northwest tip of Ireland, had ever received such a thing, nor had he himself ever delivered anything so rare. After he pedaled away from our cottage, whistling, I stood at the door holding the envelope with its bright ribbon of stamps in my hands like a colorful bird. "'Tis addressed to me," Ma said, looking at me accusingly. "You should have brought it to me at once instead of standing there like a statue. You're useless, so you are." I watched her walk back down the hall and wondered, as I often did, how such a small woman could command such a large presence. She was no taller than myself, but in my mind she still towered over me the same way she had when I was a small child. After she disappeared into the kitchen, I fled outside. I ran around the back of the cottage and up the fields to my favorite place, a group of rocks bleached white and smooth, which formed a circle beneath an ancient oak tree, and from which I could look out across the vast Atlantic Sea. I sat down on one of the rocks, panting, struggling to catch my breath. I shivered, suddenly aware of the winter cold settling around me. I had been coming up here since childhood to escape Ma's wrath. When I was young, I often cried out of self-pity, and I was convinced that it was my tears that had washed the rocks so clean. Now at 18, I no longer cried, but the hurt in my heart remained. And then over time, dreams of outward rebellion, As I sat now on a rock looking at the sea, its rough waves roiling with gray and white foam, I heard a noise behind me and turned around and saw Da in the distance, his tall, gaunt frame bent against the wind. He trudged towards the cottage carrying a bucket in each hand, each holding sods of turf for the fire. As a child, I used to run and greet him, and he would nod as soon as I ran along beside him, holding on to the handle of the bucket and trying to keep up with his long strides. I was used to his silence. I sometimes wondered if it was because he had grown up speaking Irish and was still uncomfortable with English words. I asked him once to teach me Irish, but he shook his head. "'Twould be of no use to ye," he said. "'Tis the English that run this country, and 'tis the English tongue ye'll be needing." I went up to him now and took one of the buckets and fell into step beside him, lost in my own thoughts. Then I remembered the letter from America, and my steps quickened. What surprises might it hold? Had it brought fortune? But by the time I pushed in through the cottage door, I knew, no matter what fortune the letter held, it would not be for me. And Delia is, there's a part of Irish mythology is about something called the Changeling, and it's where the fairies come and take away a child when it's born, and they put an imposter child in there, and it's usually a devil child. And in this story, Delia, the girl who's just spoken, she was born a twin, and the boy twin died right after birth, and she was left, and the mother convinced herself that this was the devil child, and from there on, she just, pretty much mistreated her, which I think was very sad, but, that does happen. Okay, this is maybe just a little bit in the Titanic. There's a whole section on the Titanic, but this is near the time of the sinking. And the lifeboat shunted, I'm going to skip a little bit, so I'm sorry if it's a bit jerky. The lifeboat shunted unsteadily, scraping the side of the ship as the seamen loosened the ropes. It rocked from side to side until we landed with a thud on the oil-black, freezing water. I was suddenly aware of a sound so terrifying that I had to cover my ears. At first I thought it was a fierce gale, like those that roared across Donegal in the winter. But this was different. I put my hands down and looked around me. The other passengers had stopped screaming and sat in mute fear. It was as if we were surrounded by a wall of sound. It was then I realized this was no gale, but the sound of wailing from the poor souls still left on the ship. We were a good distance away when the ship split in two. Slowly the stern began to sink, and we watched as if hypnotized. Within minutes, the stern had disappeared beneath the waves, and the prow of the ship was thrust upward into the sky like a contorted cathedral spire. We watched in horror as it slipped plumb straight into the sea, leaving no trace that the great ship had ever existed. Just one last little spot. This is Delia when she's in Texas, and she's been in Texas for a while, and she's standing at this ranch at a fence on this ranch, and she's looking out on the horizon, and she's watching the cowboys, actual cowboys who are rounding up the cattle and so on and so forth. I walked farther away from the house and stood leaning on a fence rail, watching cattle grazing in a distant field. From my vantage point, they looked like the longhorns I had seen over in Fort Worth when I first arrived in Texas. How long ago that seemed. A stiff breeze came up and blew away the tears that were beginning to roll down my cheeks. I shook my head hard. There was no point crying over spilled milk. The damage was done, and now I had to face the future. I breathed in the fresh air. I had learned by now that early Texas summer mornings were the most pleasant time of day. I inhaled the sweet smells of hay and dry grass, and again I thought of home. But instead of making me homesick, I found comfort in the smells. I watched the ranch hands mount their horses, their boots and spurs thrust into the stirrups, and their large hats, which I had learned were called cowboy hats, pulled down low, shading their faces. When they rode out of sight again, I was aware of the wide open space that was Texas, where the land stretched all the way to the horizon, as if it were the end of the earth. How different this place was from Ireland. Here there was room to breathe. The lives of people here were not confined by hundreds of years of tradition, by the fear of hell instilled by powerful priests, by the ridicule of neighbors, nor by the rigid rules of morality. This place was big enough to welcome risk-takers and rule-breakers, dreamers and sinners, and independent souls with their own moral code. Like the immigrants on the Titanic, people came to Texas looking for a better life, for freedom, adventure, wealth, peace, and happiness. And unlike those wretched souls drowned on the Titanic, most appeared to have found it. So that's fine. A few little bits and pieces. So please, questions, comments, thoughts? What do you want to know about writing, about how to get published, about...
I have a question.
Okay.
So I think it's interesting that when you hear the title, The Titanic Sisters, you almost imagine the Titanic is such a cinematic, big moment. And it's funny that it's right in the beginning of the book. So then, naturally, in writing it, did you feel a sort of pressure of, well, the rest of it has to be especially interesting, considering the big moment happens so early?
Well, I think, yeah. I mean, I've been accused, and it's really not my fault because I did not necessarily pick the title, but a lot of people have picked up this book thinking the whole thing is about the Titanic. But what I wanted, first of all, it's a vehicle, no pun intended, to launch the story, but it becomes a character, I think, and what I tried to do, even after it sank and dry land was there and all of the rest of it, as the story went on for both girls, and there's a whole, I won't get into what happened with the girls, but for both girls, the trauma of the Titanic was never far away. And it's something that I think any of us who've been close to a catastrophe, it will change your life. It'll change your outlook on life. And of course, in both cases, they have nightmares about it, which I would think would happen. Yeah. And but I kept it. I tried to keep it in the forefront, not in the, but sort of there, a constant reminder of the link to the Titanic and how that experience had changed both of them. And so it was, I saw it as another character. So it's a good point. You could have that. Anyone else?
I'd just like to observe that the Irish tell a story better than anybody else, any other culture that there is out there.
Well, I'm very proud of it. Thank you.
That's very true.
Yeah, now there's the pressure. You're Irish, you're a writer, well, you'd better tell a damn good story, And there's an old saying I always tell people that it's true of me, that the Irish do not know how to make a long story short.
Yes.
I mean, and it is part of the oral tradition. And I grew up with it, as a young child, and mostly, a lot of times, be ghost stories, which is great fun. My father was from the west of Ireland, and down there, in the real rural areas, that had the putching stills outside, the door, and the big turf fire going. And the neighbors would come in, and there'd be a wee bit of music, somebody might have an accordion or whatever, and then the stories would start, and it would go till 3 or 4 in the morning, And some of them would be, when you're little, some of them would be pretty scary. I mean, we had headless horsemen, and we had all kinds of monsters in the graveyard, and, you know, ghosts appearing on the road after they'd been on a ship where they were supposed to have drowned, and all sorts of things. And, you know, if you're driving along, there used to be a poster that was just a black poster, nothing, and it was called Ireland by Night. And it was because out on the country roads, I mean, they didn't have lamps.
Right.
And so you could, if you were anyway inclined towards a little bit of mysticism, I mean, you could be looking out and saying, you know, my God, you know, did that tree just move? Or did I see something shining behind the trunk of that tree? Could it be, you know, some fairy there? And, you know, and they have the fairy glens and the circles that a lot of times farmers will not, they'll not ever, you know, uproot a tree that's in a fairy circle. Well, there'll be stones, you know, and that will be the fairy circle. And because God forbid they should do that, that the little people would have their way with them, and it would not be pretty. So, so yeah, thank you for saying that. But yeah, that they pride themselves on storytelling and a little bit of kind of odd humor. I actually said in the Girls of Ennismore, where I had a bunch of servants that were working in the big house, and you know, the cooks and the maids and all the rest of it. And whereas I said, you know, in Downton Abbey, the English servants were very proper and very polite to the upper classes, whereas the Irish were a rebellious lot. And they would say things and laugh and make jokes, and, you know, they got away with a lot more because, you know, I guess it was hard to keep good staff, but they got away with a lot more because of their sense of humor. And, you know, they would talk about, oh, did you see the cut of himself? And, you know, they'd be going on about, you know, what the upper classes were doing, and this was great fun for them, and so on. Just a very different approach to life. And yeah, so anyway, but thank you. Yeah, you had a question? I think the lady behind you.
What are you working on now?
Oh, okay. I'm so glad you asked that. I have to confess, for the last couple of years, I've been kind of, as I like to put it, lying fallow. It's just, you know, I think with COVID, and I don't know what it was, but the fact that normally my routine would be after I'd finish a book, and once it was published, I would go over to Ireland and, you know, help sell it over there, you know, do the marketing, go to the bookstores, you know, whatever. And also my well would fill up when I would be over there, because, you know, there's always more stories, there's always more inspiration. And I didn't get to do that for a couple of years. And so the well remained dry, unfortunately. And, but now I'm beginning to come out of my cave. And in fact, I was home, I call it home, in Ireland in November. And I did meet with this man with the lovely name of Hugh McShane, which I think is quite a lovely, you know, poetic name. And he's a historian. And I'd come across some speeches and papers that he had done on one particular issue. And it was something that before COVID and everything, I had been actually thinking about writing a book about. And so now along here comes this guy, and he's sort of into this same idea, and I'm like, oh, I have to meet him. So I did go and meet him, and it was very fun, and we're in touch now. And the story is about, it's a true story. It's set during the famine years in Ireland. It will be set in the 1840s, late 1840s. And I'm going to call it the Famine Orphans, and it is a scheme that was set up by this fellow in Britain who was a superintendent for Australia, and his name was Earl Grey. And I don't know if his descendants were the tea people, but I'm definitely going to find that out. And you have to understand, at that time, Australia was known as England's prisons. And both England and Ireland, because England was in charge of Ireland at the time, anybody, from small things like pickpocketing to, like a murder crime all the way, so many of these people who became prisoners were sent on prison ships to Australia. And they were working the land and building and doing whatever it was, and they would have, depending on the crime, they would have a number of years to work off their sentence, and then they would get free papers. So Australia became overwhelmed with these relatively young, for the most part, unruly men, convicts. And so there was this thought that, gee, it would be nice if there were more women here. And they can civilize that these men, and we can build settlements, and Australia will flourish. And so anyway, where they decided to get the women was from the workhouses. And during the famine, of course, many young girls were in these workhouses. They were orphaned, most of them. Some maybe not, but they were all starving, and they all ended up there. And it was costing what I called the worthies of the town, because they were the board of governors in each town who managed the workhouse and paid the expenses through taxes or whatever. And so Earl Grey dispatched a bunch of people from London to go around Ireland and quote unquote sell this scheme. It was called the Earl Grey scheme. And they were looking for girls 15 to 20 who of relatively good character, who maybe if they were able to read or write, that was a plus. If they could speak English, that was a plus, because most of them still spoke Irish. And but basically they said it was volunteer. Now, who knows whether it was or wasn't, but they went around anyway and talked to these girls and said, we promise you a brand new life, a lovely life in Australia, and we will pay all your expenses. We will even, for each one of them, they actually put together a hope chest, which is kind of weird, but a hope chest with, you think of young brides, with the hope chest, and there would be certain clothing and a bonnet, though they each had a bonnet, and certain other things in this hope chest that would be theirs and theirs alone. And so they were sent on the ships, and these were like 3 or 4 months of journey on these ships. And I mean, most of these girls had never been out of their little villages, let alone anything else. Now, some did make out fairly well, others not so much. There were a lot of them were expected to go to work in domestic service with the bigger houses, the wealthier people in these areas. And many of them, they're pretty much all of them were Catholic. And so they did not sit well with the mostly English matrons, if you will. They decided that many of these girls, and they didn't have the skills, the domestic skills, they'd never had an indoor toilet, or, all of this kind of thing, girls from the country. And so they were disparaged a great deal. Many of them were just turned out. Others were, it was one of these things where they would, over there, the people who were part of the program, would bring all these girls together in like a big hall of some sort, and they would invite the locals in, and they could pick whoever they wanted. And, a girl was lucky if she didn't get some guy, who lived on his own, but was a quote-unquote respectable gentleman, but you never knew. And so they became known. Actually, it's pretty well known in Australia. They have a museum in Sydney that honors them, and they're also known in many circles as the mothers of Australia, because that's who, that's what they did. They got married mostly to get away from the nasty landlady people, and they ended up generally having a lot of children and so on, many of whom went on to be really important people in Australia. But I found out I was originally going to have a girl from one of the southern counties, because that's kind of where the famine was worse. But I've discovered since that there were a number of girls from my hometown in Uri that were sent as well. So I'm going to do that. So I'm going to work with Hugh on that, and I will do the fiction version, because as a historian, he just does not do fiction. He said, I don't trust, a publisher to make sure that it's all proper, and you know how he would be as an academic. And so we've agreed on it, and it's okay. So I'm going to be going over there next year. They're having a memorial, a whole thing about it. I'm going to go over and speak. So I'm kind of excited about it. So, and also I get to go to Australia, which I couldn't do because of COVID. And that's another thing about historical fiction. I know Ireland pretty well because I've been there so many times besides growing up there. But I like to go and, as I say, walk the streets of the place that I'm writing about. I need to understand what it's like. Like, these girls are from Donegal. I spent the last 2 or 3 visits ago, spent a fair amount of time up in Donegal, just going around it and looking at it, getting a sense of it, and so on. And I think you have to kind of breathe it in and sort of just let it be part of you as you're writing something. So I could probably fake Australia. I imagine there's enough books on it, there's enough movies on it, but I'd feel like I was cheating, so plus I've always wanted to go, so I think I might, go and do that. So yeah, it's right now, I could call it the Potato Orphans, but I'm not sure, and the publisher usually will have the final say on that, but my publisher is happy about it. Oh, and one other thing, how could I forget? The Titanic Sisters is right now, but this is a big, fingers crossed, long shot thing, but I have signed an option and then an extension of the option with a couple of women in Los Angeles who are film producers. And since now, apparently at one time to get a movie made out of historical fiction was really, really difficult because it was expensive, you were talking to the big studios and so on. But now, of course, with Netflix and Amazon and all the rest of them, they're just looking for content. And with the success of some of these period pieces, there's much more interest in it. So these 2 women approached my agent in New York and said, we think, and they did a whole vision statement, which is very, very interesting because they were looking, and I said to them on the Zoom call, I said, you actually read the book, and they just thought that was hysterical. Well, of course we read the book. I said, well, a lot of times people who review a book, they'll dip into it, but they won't really read the whole thing. But they've gone through and decided from a visual point of view why this could work. Not from a reader's point of view, but like this will take us to these different places, although they sort of indicated that a lot of it could be filmed in Nova Scotia and you wouldn't know the difference. But by the same token, the conflicts, the sister versus sister, the mother, there's a couple of things, there's suffragettes in here, there's Me Too, a little bit of, women and that sort of thing. And so they went through the whole thing, and things that I didn't even realize were in there, in terms of themes and so forth. That's what they decided to do. So they've been shopping it in to the studios out there, and we'll see.
Wow.
Again,
Very
it's a long
exciting.
shot, but it would be great fun
Yeah.
to just do. The only problem is the first thing they wanted to know, besides whether or not I drooled on my shoes, I guess, they wanted to talk to me, and basically they said, how wedded are you to the actual story? And I said, well, as long as I can still vaguely recognize it, have at it. But I guess there have been some horror stories about, because once you option it, the movie people have the say on it. And I knew enough actually because of that time in California, and I'd taken some screenwriting classes, and they would have things like the teacher would say, Oh, this is, so this is a screenplay. It's about a young heterosexual couple in 1980 London. Do you mind if we do it about a gay couple in Milan in the 1700s? You know, it's like, but I mean, it can be that extreme that they will change an awful lot of it. And so I always, you know, even though I always, between a book and a movie, I always like the book, you know, but, you know, it's interesting to see what they will do with the movie. But they do have two screenwriters signed on, and they asked, would I be interested in doing the screenplay? And I couldn't. I mean, that's not my thing. I don't know how I could take this and make it into like a 120-page screenplay, which is normally what they run, double-spaced. And so, but they have two women now with good records of screenplays, and they're working on it. So it's a collaborative thing where they have to first they get the screenwriters, and they have to get a director, and then they have to get somebody to put up the money, and you know, so we'll see. We'll keep posted on. Yes, good vibes. So anyway.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, you are so welcome. You're so welcome. I'm always very happy to, you know, talk to other readers and writers alike. And if any of you have books you want me to sign, I'll be happy to do that too. So,
There are no more books here.
apparently not.
They're sold out. But you can order them.
You can order it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So just go to the register and order them.
Yeah. And like I said, this is the fourth of 4 books. So, you know, and then they don't have to be read in any kind of order, you know, they're all individual, different.
Right. And we can order any of them, as you mentioned.
Good. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank
Wow.
you.